On New Year's Eve, when the streets were shrouded in shimmering snow and people were preparing to welcome the new year with merriment and joy, something terrible happened in a quiet suburb. The house stood in the shade of tall trees, its windows dark, as if darkness itself had inhabited this abandoned house. It was silent inside, as if the souls left inside were holding their breath in anticipation of evil. The owner of the house, an old man named Edward Grimsby, was known for his strange behavior. He rarely left his home and maintained a minimum of communication with the outside world. Anyone who ventured close to his house felt an invisible wall of fear, as if the air was filled with darkness. Nevertheless, on New Year's Eve, many neighbors decided to gather together to celebrate the arrival of the new year. Cheer and laughter spread down the street, leaving only one house unaffected: Edward's. Around midnight, one of the daredevils, named Michael, decided to look inside to find out why the old man was so strictly avoiding society. Upon entering the house, Michael felt a coldness not unlike the usual frost. The dark corridors engulfed him like the ominous embrace of an unknown evil. Suddenly there was a sound, a low but threatening whisper that grew with each step. Michael paused, racked by an agonizing premonition. Something flickered in the darkness like ghostly shadows, and the next instant he saw them, dead eyes glittering in the darkness. At that moment footsteps were heard in the room. Michael noted with his gaze the bloody footprints on the floor leading deeper into the house. Rushing forward, he discovered a horrifying scene. The room was filled with dead bodies, blood covering the walls like a horror painting. Michael was left stunned as he realized that each body belonged to a member of his community. The assassin lurking in the shadows began whispering again, calling his name. With a dark fear in his heart, Michael realized that he would not be able to escape this nightmare. The darkness absorbed him as sand absorbs water, and everything froze in the bottomless night of that New Year's Eve horror. Everything around him froze in that horror that permeated every corner of this cursed house. Michael stood there, numb with terror, his eyes staring at the shadows, which seemed something darker and more sinister than the darkness itself. The whispering grew ominous, like a wind carrying something ancient and dark. The shadows around them began to dance, forming strange shapes, as if dead souls were reaching out to swallow Michael into this hellish nightmare. With each step forward, the darkness grew denser, as if it had a will of its own. Michael heard footsteps behind him, but when he turned around, there was no one in sight. Everything in this house seemed alive, as if evil itself was coming through the walls. He passed through a corridor where the shadows seemed to whisper terrible secrets, and entered a room from which the darkness was thickest. There was an antique chest in the corner, and the darkness around it was so thick that it seemed to absorb Michael's own light. His heart beat in unison with a whisper, and a fear unknown until that moment awakened within him. He approached the chest as if something sinister was inviting him to open its ancient lock. With a dark gleam in his eyes, Michael slowly lifted the lid of the chest, and darkness burst out of it like a stream of black smoke. Shadows engulfed him, and he felt his essence dissolving into that darkness. And at the last moment, as his consciousness was being swallowed up by the darkness, he heard the very whisper cursing this house and those who dared to invade its bottomless secrets. Once again the mysterious voice sounded, heralding the inevitable evil that would remain unrevealed in the dark web of time. The next moment Michael found himself in another room, now full of mirrors. He saw his reflection in each one, but the eyes in those reflections were bottomless and devoid of humanity. The shadows melted around him, creating the illusion that his soul was dissolving into the vast darkness. The mirrors were now posters reflecting terrible moments from Michael's past. In each mirror he saw dead neighbors, his friends and relatives, all drowned in this sea of darkness. Their eyes were full of fear, their faces expressing the final moment of terror as the evil descended upon them. The whispers grew louder, as if the darkness was trying to find its voice. Michael felt his essence being pulled in different directions, as if dark hands were ripping a part of his soul from him. He tried to close his eyes, to get away from this nightmare, but everywhere he looked he saw only his own reflection in the mirrors, the flickering eyes of the abyss. The room began to spin around him, and he lost his sense of reality. Suddenly, in the last mirror before him, he saw his reflection standing in this dark room, but the look in his reflection was filled with the same terror as the others. A whisper pierced his ears, foreshadowing something terrible and irreversible. The darkness swallowed Michael whole, and his scream faded into the bottomless void. The mirrors shimmered like ominous portals to another world where souls are condemned to wander forever, deprived of light and peace. In this boundless darkness, the whispers continued to melt into the air, and the house, like its master Edward Grimsby, continued to consume every soul that dared to break its silence. Only the memory of the murder on New Year's Eve remained in the darkness, and anyone who approached the place was condemned to become another shadow consumed by this vast nightmare. Michael suddenly woke up on the floor, in the room where the nightmare had begun. The sweat had receded from his forehead, but his heart was still beating hard, as if he had just experienced true terror. He looked around and found that the darkness had disappeared, and the house looked as ordinary and abandoned as before. But there was still a tinge of fear in his soul that didn't want to leave him. Michael slowly rose to his feet and walked out of this place of nightmare. The New Year's snow was falling softly from the sky, as if trying to wash away the shadow of the past. He paced the street, trying to forget what he had seen, but every rustle in the wind reminded him of the dark whispers and screams from that cursed room. There was a New Year's Eve party ahead of him, people laughing and cheering. But the whispers of darkness, rather than the solemn melodies, were not what he heard in his soul, and he could not forget the nightmare he had seen. He kept walking, not noticing the festive lights and merriment around him. The shadow of the murder on New Year's Eve still laid its imprint on his soul, and every step he took was a reminder that darkness can creep into the deepest corners of even the brightest of celebrations. Michael paced the street, but the shadow of the past continued to linger behind him like an invisible ghost. The same bottomless reflection from the dark room flickered in his eyes, and every person passing by seemed to him a potential bearer of evil. The bright lanterns and holiday decorations dimly tried to dispel the gloom, but inside Michael, the curse of darkness continued to press down on him. His mind was eclipsed by the nightmare he'd experienced at Edward Grimsby's house. With each step into the thick of the New Year's Eve fun, Michael felt the darkness clutching his heart ominously. He tried to push those dark thoughts away, but the whispers of the past would not leave him. He was a prisoner of his own fear. In the distance, the chime sounded, announcing the coming of a new year. Everyone around them was cheering, hugging, welcoming the year with smiles on their faces. But for Michael, these joyous shouts and laughter were only a muffled background to his own inner hell. He kept walking, not knowing how to rid himself of this shadow that consumed his soul. On this night filled with laughter and holiday lights, Michael had become the very embodiment of horror, and the darkness of the past had turned him into its prisoner, devoid of hope of deliverance. Michael, consumed by the darkness of his own nightmares, walked through the crowd of revelers, slowly losing the last crumbs of reason under the pressure of unknown forces. His gaze was hard and restless, as if there was a piece of evil that had just awakened in him. Amidst the merriment and festive lights, Michael noticed one man who stood out in the crowd with his joyful smile and selfless joy. This man, a cloud of merriment around him, stood nearby, enjoying the New Year's Eve night. The darkness inside Michael began to simmer, and an idea began to brew in his mind, as if it had been planted by the darkness itself. The whispers in his ears grew, filling his mind with dark determination. Michael approached his victim in this bright and cheerful moment. The smile on Michael's face looked ghastly and distorted by the darkness. No one noticed this otherworldly horror hiding behind the facade of celebration. Michael's heart beat in unison with the footsteps approaching the outcome of this New Year's Eve drama. In his hands, the points of chilling daggers flickered, gaping for those who could discern the dark intentions hidden in this crowd of merriment. At that moment, the man with a smile on his face turned around, meeting Michael's gaze. But instead of a joyful greeting, his eyes reflected horror. Michael's face was a shadow of the nightmare itself, and his hands carried the inescapable darkness with them. And in the last moment of the New Year's Eve night, a scream echoed around the merrymakers, swallowed up by the darkness. New Year's Eve had welcomed its new occupant, one whose mind was filled with dark memories and a thirst for revenge. Michael, shrouded in the darkness of his actions, stepped quickly out of the crowd, his heart beating so hard he could feel every beat in his temples. The daggers still glinted in his hands, a reminder of the sinister act that had just been committed. The darkness within him tightly enveloped his soul like an ominous fog that followed him. Michael raced through the snowy streets without looking back, his steps as quick and ruthless as his decisions. The house he lived in stood in the distance, like the last refuge in this New Year's Eve nightmare. Michael tore open the door, slamming it shut with such force that the sound reverberated through the empty room. The darkness behind him didn't stay outside, it crept inside, following him like an ominous shadow calling for the nightmare to continue. Lighting the lone lamp, Michael threw off his wet clothes, they were stained with blood and snow. He stood in the darkened room, scrutinizing his reflection in the mirror, but now his gaze was cold and devoid of humanity. Now, sitting in the complete silence of his home, Michael began to realize the full horror of his act. The darkness around him slowly began to deepen into his essence, seemingly consuming his soul as he realized the irreparability of his actions. With a look full of terror and emptiness, Michael was left sitting in the darkness of his home, a prisoner of his own nightmares, knowing that not even home could protect him from the dark aftermath of New Year's Eve night. Michael, sitting in the darkness of his home, felt the weight of his act within him. The mirrors in the room reflected his haggard face, which now hid something dark and sinister. Every moment spent in the darkness reminded him of the victims of his own hell. His hands trembled as he realized that by the will of his actions, he had become an instrument of darkness. Michael's eyes were filled with the horror he had brought into his life. Everything that had once been clear and bright now seemed submerged in the darkness he himself had caused. Michael stood up and began to wander around his house as if trying to escape from himself. In every corner he saw the ghosts of his victims, whose screams now echoed in his mind. The darkness he had brought into his life haunted him like a shadow, and every step reminded him that it was impossible to escape the consequences of his sinister actions. Everything around him began to slowly dim, including the light from the windows, as if the world itself was rejecting him. Michael realized that he couldn't escape his past, and his eyes reflected powerless despair. The darkness in his soul continued to grow, and he realized that in this night he had lost not only his humanity, but also the light that had once shone in his soul. All that was left was the shadow of the past that he had become entangled in, unable to find a way out. Michael wandered through his house like a ghost in his own nightmare. The sounds of his own footsteps became a growing echo of sins, echoing off the walls and reminding him of the sinister events he had just set in motion. He began to hear whispers of air, as if the darkness in his mind had come to life and now whispered vague and frightening words. The voices of the dead victims, like ghosts, began to haunt him in every corner of his mind. Michael began to see the ghosts of his victims standing around him. Their eyes were filled with terror and accusation, and their shadows became more and more real. When he tried to close his eyes, their screams penetrated to the very depths of his soul. His mind began to distort reality. The paintings on the walls became a source of nightmares, visualizing the darkness he brought into this world. He began to see bloody footprints where there were none, and shadows reached out to him, as if they wanted to suck him into a bottomless black flame. With each passing moment, Michael's mind slid into the abyss of madness. He began to talk to himself, trying to avoid the ghosts' gazes and whispers, but they penetrated his mind, undermining the last vestiges of his sanity. The New Year's Eve light outside came through the windows, but to Michael the whole world became black and white and distorted by the darkness of his sins. He began to notice strange shadows dancing slowly in the corners of the room, and swirls of his own madness enveloped him in the vanishing light. In that moment of senselessness, as the darkness in his soul consumed the last vestige of sanity, Michael felt there was no turning back. Every whisper, every ghost of his victims reminded him of the irreparability of his actions. The forces of madness dragged him into the depths of hell, and the shadow of the past became his only company. The thickening darkness seemed to tear away the last stronghold of reality, and Michael was left alone with his nightmares. He slowly raised his hands to his face, trying to block out the visionary images of horror that swept over his mind. But every gesture of his hands reflected despair, only emphasizing the powerlessness before what he had caused. And then, against the restless light of the New Year's Eve night, the darkness swallowed Michael whole. His figure melted into that darkness, and only the whispers of their vanishing minds continued to resound, reminding him of the irreversibility of evil. In those final moments of New Year's Eve, Michael lost himself in the darkness of his own madness, and his home witnessed a silent tragedy that carried the boundless horror of murder on New Year's Eve.